about an underutilized tool in prairie restoration and how this tool might affect the mean health of the plants. Prairies are among the most endangered ecosystems. During pre-European settlement, there was around 61% of prairie vegetation cover in Illinois. Post-European settlement and currently today, there is less than 1% of prairie vegetation remaining in Illinois. Prairies are vital ecosystems because they maintain and increase abundances of important wildlife, insects, and plants, and they also reduce runoff and erosion. And ecological restoration is a key component to maintaining these important ecosystems as well as managing the remnant and restored areas. So we don't get why some restorations work and some don't. Well, there are many possibilities to consider as to why some work and some don't, and I'm here today to talk about one of those possibilities. It is, if we plant more biodiverse plots, will it lead to better restorations? People in the past have looked at genetic level diversity, species level diversity, and functional trait diversity when restoring prairies, but none have looked at phylogenetic diversity. And phylogenetic diversity is the evolutionary distance between species. And to give you a better understanding of what phylogenetic diversity is, if I want to represent what is low phylogenetic diversity, I would pick 3 families from the monocots because less evolutionary history is being captured. And you have to go, you don't have to go as far back in the phylogenetic tree to their most recent common ancestor. If I wanted to represent what was high phylogenetic diversity, I'd pick 2 families from the dicots and 2 families from the monocots because more evolutionary history is being captured. And you have to go farther back on the phylogenetic tree to their most recent common ancestor that they share. So why is phylogenetic diversity important to consider? Well, in a recent study where they compared average productivity, or the biomass of plants, to the level of phylogenetic diversity, they found that phylogenetic diversity influences the productivity of plants. So you can see from this figure, as the level of phylogenetic diversity increased, the productivity of the plants increased as well. And phylogenetic diversity is important to consider because, looking at this figure, there's phylogenetic relationships between 6 different species, and where their functional axis falls reflects phylogenetic affinities. Basically, this figure is showing us that there's more functional overlap between more closely related species. And functional overlap is how much species compete with one another. So we'd want higher phylogenetic diversity because there'd be less competition between species. And there's a list of traits that we decided to measure for this study. At first, we just wanted to look at phylogenetic diversity, but we decided to incorporate functional trait diversity. But because we see differences in the evolutionary distances between species, we'd expect to see differences in their traits. So, looking at the bigger picture, setting up this experiment, Dr. Andrew Hipp knew that functional trait diversity and phylogenetic diversity shape species coexistence. So he wanted to know if incorporating these two, would it lead to better restorations? And for the purposes of my study, I'm investigating the mean health of the first year plants that were established in this prairie restoration experiment that was established in 2015 at the Morton Arboretum. So this is an aerial shot of when the site was first set up. There are 326 4-meter squared prairie plots in which either 1 or 15 species are drawn from a candidate set of 127 species. There are 72 treatments and 254 monocultures. And this was set up as a 2 superblock experiment, so you can see that with the west and the east superblock. And those were determined based on their depth to the A horizon or the organic layer. So for example, the west has a deeper A horizon and the east has a thinner A horizon. And the purposes of my study, I looked at it as a 2 superblock experiment because it's more straightforward because the monocultures and the treatments were replicated on both sides. And you can see that here with the monoculture of Baptisia alba is on the west and on the east side. So for the treatment plots, there are 3 levels of phylogenetic diversity, high, medium, low, by 2 levels of functional trait diversity, high and low, giving us a total of 6 treatments. And within those 6 treatments, there are 6 different species assemblages. And they're replicated on both the west and the east, giving us a total of 72 treatments. For the monocultures, for out of the 127 species, they were all planted as a monoculture, and they were replicated on both sides, giving us a total of 254. And the purpose of the monocultures is to tease out the effects that we might be seeing in the treatment plots. So So knowing all of this, we wanted to see if the level of phylogenetic and functional trait diversity and species level diversity have any influence on the mean health of the plants in their first year of growth. So this led me to hypothesize that phylogenetic diversity would positively correlate with the mean health of the plants because more niche space is being used up and symbiotic relationships are being established. I also hypothesized that higher functional trait diversity would negatively correlate with the mean health because of competitive interactions where maybe the more dominant species are suppressing the growth of the smaller species. Both of these are not going on at the same time. We just want to see if either one of them or neither of them are happening. So this led me to predict that a higher level of phylogenetic diversity would lead to higher mean health, and higher functional trait diversity would lead to lower mean health. So how I collected my data was that I analyzed each plant in all 326 plots, looking at their state or quality that they were in at the time of data collection, and I put them into 4 categories of either 0, 1, 2, and 3. And here's an example of an Asclepias monoculture on site. So to give you an idea of how I would categorize the plants, where the 0 is, there's an empty spot, so you assume that plant's dead. Where there was a 1, you can't really see, but it has a lot of brown vegetation, so you think it's not doing so well. For a 2, the plant is upright and has green vegetation, but it's not the best that it's in the plot that you can see from 3, where it has green, bushy, full vegetation. So after collecting all of my data, we statistically analyzed it all in R, and I wanted to look at the monoculture mean health first. So we took the mean health of the monocultures from the west and from the east, and we averaged the 2. And we input them onto a phylogenetic tree where the dots, for all the dots, they represent the mean health for all 127 species. And we found that there was a species selection effect happening, which basically means that the more closely related species tend to have similar survival rates. And the reason they might have these similar survival rates because they're similar phenotypically, so they have less time to diverse from one another, and they're similar ecologically because they're growing in the same environmental conditions. Overall, this is just showing us the expected data that we were getting from the monocultures. So now that we've had the expected data, we wanted to evaluate to see if there was a diversity effect happening in the treatments. A diversity effect meaning the correlation between the level of diversity to the mean health of the plants. And as I said before, the monoculture's purpose is to tease out those effects that we're seeing in the treatments. So one of these effects that we would like to see is the selection effect, which is basically the correlation of a species growing in a monoculture and its change in performance going from the monoculture to the treatment. So if we saw a positive correlation, species that are doing well in a monoculture would do even better in a treatment because it's a highly competitive species. If we saw a negative correlation, the species that are doing well in the monoculture would do even worse because their competitiveness is being suppressed by the other species that they're growing with. Another effect that we hope to see is the complementarity effect, which is the consequences of species growing together. So if I were to plant the species that were tall, short, have different root depths, more niche space would be used up and there'd be other processes like facilitation or symbiotic relationships happening. So basically species that are growing together are making the environment better for the other species that they're growing with. And overall, the net effect is the selection effect plus the complementarity effect. So overall, we wanted to see if any of these diversity mechanisms were being influenced by the level of phylogenetic and functional trait diversity, as well as being influenced by that superblock factor where I explained the west and the east superblocks. So after I collected all of my treatment data, and for the purposes of my study, we only looked at plots that had only 14 species in them, so that reduced the number that I analyzed from 72 to 58 treatments. But I input this data into various multiple regression models, and the one I decided to focus on was where the diversity effect, or the net effect, is a function of trait diversity, phylogenetic diversity, and superblock. Unfortunately, we found no significant results for the level of phylogenetic and functional trait diversity because their p-values were greater than 0.05%, so we failed to reject the null hypothesis. So we saw that there was no difference in the level of treatment with the diversity effect. However, we found that there was significance with the superblock factor because its p-value was less than 0.05%, so we can correctly, confidently reject that null hypothesis. So we were seeing a difference in the diversity effect in the superblocks. And we can see that here, that there's a positive net effect in the east superblock, which is telling me that the mean health in the treatments in the east superblock is higher than the treatments in the west superblock. And that might be because of the harsher conditions found on the east side. It has a thinner A horizon, so less organic matter, and it was weeded less. We found no significance of the selection effect, which is basically what those zeros are just showing. But we found a positive complementarity effect in the east superblock, which is actually driving that positive net effect I showed you on the previous figure. And the positive complementarity effect is telling us species are performing better because they're growing together. However, when we combine the treatment data from the west and the east, we found that there was actually no net effect, so you can see from here. But that's good because that's telling us throughout the whole site the treatments are constant in performance. We are seeing a positive complementarity effect as well, which is also good because across the whole site, the species and the treatments are performing better because they are growing together. However, when we saw there was a diversity effect, we wanted to see if that there was a difference in the mean health in the monocultures from the west versus the east and the treatments from the west versus the east. So I predicted that for both the monocultures and the treatments, their mean health would be higher in the west because of the higher quality conditions, more organic matter and being weeded more. This is what we would expect to see if there was no difference in their mean health. This is what we expect if the mean health was higher in the west than the east, and if the mean health was higher in the east than the west, we would expect to see this. So when I combined the monoculture data from the west and the east and ran a paired t-test, we found that on average, the monocultures in the west superblock was 0.917 survival units higher than the monocultures in the east. And you can see that with this graph, there's predominantly more blue lines, which I showed you on the previous figures. That tells us that the west is higher in mean health than the east. However, when we combined the data for the treatments and ran a paired t-test, we didn't see as much of a significant difference. On average, the east was 0.122 survival units higher than the west, and you can see that here, there's somewhat slightly more red lines, and that's just telling us that the east is higher in mean health than the west. Overall, we don't understand why there's a difference between the mean health, how the monocultures are higher in mean health than the west, and the treatments are higher in mean health than the east. It could be due to stochastic factors such as the amount of watering or weeding that was done. Overall, it could just be attributed to the biased collection that we had. So for me and my collaborators, some was collected just on the west superblock, and the others collected just on the east. And assigning such arbitrary numbers of 0, 1, 2, and 3 to plants leaves everything up to interpretation. So what I could have saw as a 2 for a plant, someone could have saw it as a 3, like it was doing really well. But overall, my data analysis shows us that there's a diversity effect happening, being driven by that complementarity effect, which is so great to see early on in the first year of growth. However, for future studies, I would like to combine my mean data to hopefully reduce some of that bias that we're seeing. I would also like to analyze some of the soils data to see if it has any influence on those diversity mechanisms, in turn the mean health of the plants. It remains to be seen whether the level of phylogenetic and functional trait diversity have effect on the restoration outcomes in future years. If so, it would help us understand the underlying mechanisms behind successful restorations, thus assist us in making for a successful restoration. I would like to thank my mentor, Dr. Andrew Hipp, for setting up this awesome experiment, and my advisor, Mary Claire Glazenhart. She taught me so much along the way and helps with the process. And the high school interns from Downward Groves North, they helped me so much with this project, and the awesome volunteers for keeping the prairie beautiful, and it helped the data collection go smoothly. And the undergraduate research mentors, Dr. Sylvia Alvarez, Claire, and Christine. And I'd like to thank Team Arboretum, especially Casey Fibb, for those amazing illustrations. And finally, the National Science Foundation and the Morton Arboretum for giving me this amazing opportunity. Thank you.
So when did you do most of your health assessments, and do you think you might have had slightly different results if you had maybe done your health assessments at different points of the time or over the course of the growing season?
We did it within a week because I feel like, the plants would have changed in health if we spread it out a lot. So I feel like we need to do it in a shorter amount of time because there are just so many outside factors that are affecting the plant's health. So we wanted to make sure we did it within the same amount of time period because otherwise, let's say like the next week we would have weeded plots A, B, and C, then maybe that plant's health would have been higher now because we weeded that. So we wanted to get it within the same amount of time period, so it wouldn't affect that.
So in these experiments, there's a lot of weeding going on. How does weeding potentially affect the results? If you weeded more intensively or if you didn't weed, how would that create different results?
Probably because there is a lot of like competition going on with the weeds. There's a lot of just invasives that we found that like when we would get to a plot that was super weedy, and once we got rid of all the weeds, we're like, oh wow, there actually are plants that we want in here. Or we're like, wow, there should have been a plant where this huge weed was. So yeah, if we didn't weed at all, I'm sure the results would have been, the mean health would have been significantly lower compared to since we did weed, it's probably much higher.